In the Viking Age, marriage was not always born of love. It was a contract, a trade, a promise sealed not by hearts, but by hands. And sometimes, those hands were painfully small. Tonight, we step into the shadows of the Viking hearth, beyond the sagas of raiders and kings, to uncover a story few ever tell, the story of Viking child marriage. Who were these children, bound in adulthood before they could even name it? And why did the fiercest warriors in Europe believe it was necessary? Stay till the end, because the truth buried in this forgotten ritual reveals not just how the Vikings lived, but how they feared time itself. Childhood in the Viking world was not what we imagine. There were no long years of innocence, no classrooms or carefree games. From the moment a child could walk, they were trained for purpose. Boys learned to wield axes before they learned to write their names. Girls mastered the loom, the hearth, and the art of negotiation before their first moon cycle. At 16, a boy could be called a man. At 12, a girl could be promised. But in a society where survival hinged on alliances, property, and legacy, what did childhood even mean? Let's open that first chapter. Marriage in the Viking Age was not a union of souls. It was a transaction between families. There were laws, dowries, and bride prices. A girl was given, not chosen. A man could only marry with the consent of his kin, and a woman only with the blessing of her father or guardian. In a world where power was passed through bloodlines, marriage meant survival. And sometimes that survival came at the expense of youth. Because to delay marriage was to risk the future. There were no written laws in Viking Scandinavia that said a girl must be 16 or 18 to wed. What mattered was puberty, the visible sign of fertility. Once a girl could bear children, society deemed her ready to marry. Historians believe many Viking brides were married between the ages of 12 and 15. Their husbands often twice their age, men who had already proven themselves in trade or war. To us, that sounds barbaric. To them, it was a natural transaction in the circle of survival. But this wasn't just about custom. There were darker reasons beneath it. And they would shape the fate of countless young girls across the North. The Icelandic sagas, those haunting, half-historical echoes of the Viking world, were written long after the events they describe. Yet hidden between their lines are quiet, unsettling clues about the lives of the youngest brides of the North. One saga tells of Un, a girl married at just 12. Her husband, a man of high standing, was chosen not for affection, but for advantage. Another recounts a feast held in a smoky longhouse, where a bride, barely a teenager, sits still as elders toast her union. Laughter fills the air, but beneath it lies a funeral silence. For this is not just her wedding feast, it is her farewell to childhood. The sagas do not mourn her. They do not question the fairness of it. They speak with a tone as cold and practical as the northern wind, describing these marriages with unnerving normalcy. To the Vikings, such unions were not scandalous, they were necessary. A girl's value was bound to her fertility, her ability to tie families together through blood and sons. Waiting too long meant risking alliances, losing honor, or letting a rival house claim the advantage. But behind that logic lived something darker: fear. Not fear of sin or morality, but fear of extinction. Lineage was life. A broken bloodline meant weakness, and weakness could destroy a family faster than any sword. So they bartered away their daughters to keep their names alive. And perhaps in their eyes, the true tragedy wasn't that childhood was stolen, but that time itself was always the enemy. Because in the frozen North, legacy was the only warmth that could outlive the grave. A daughter was currency. The younger she was, the longer her husband could ensure heirs, and the stronger the alliance between families. Marriage in this brutal calculus was an investment, one measured in years of fertility, not emotional readiness. And when her father handed her over, the exchange wasn't cloaked in ceremony. It was an act of strategy. Yet even in this grim system, there were whispers of resistance. Women who found ways to reclaim their voice. Sometimes through cunning, sometimes through blood. We'll get to them soon. But first, let's step into the legal side of this haunting practice. The Vikings prized law, but their laws reflected power, not morality. In their world, order was sacred, a shield against chaos. Yet the same codes that kept clans from tearing each other apart also bound their daughters in invisible chains. Marriage wasn't merely a family affair, it was a legal transaction, a contract witnessed by men and sanctified by silver. A woman's guardian, her father, brother, or in his absence, her closest male relative, decided her fate. He negotiated her marriage, determined her worth in coin, and offered her hand as though she were a link in a long ancestral chain. If she resisted, her refusal could stain the family's honor, a mark harder to erase than blood. Honor was currency, and a daughter's defiance could bankrupt a lineage. If she obeyed, she became property in every sense the word could mean, passed from one man to another, along with the fields, livestock, and treasures that sealed the deal. Even after marriage, the word consent took on a different form. It didn't mean freedom of will, it meant compliance. To consent was to obey, to accept her role as the quiet pillar of a household ruled by a man who may have been a stranger. Yet within this bleak pattern, there were cracks, faint, defiant glimmers of rebellion. The sagas tell of women who refused their arranged fates, who defied their families, and in doing so, risked exile, ruin, or death. They were few, forgotten. But their defiance, whispered through generations, became legend. Because in a world ruled by contracts and swords, a woman's no was the most dangerous weapon she could wield. If you've made it this far, you already sense the darkness beneath Viking glory. These aren't tales of gods and gold. They're stories of power, fear, and the fragile lives caught in between. If you're drawn to this kind of truth, the ones that history hides behind heroism, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on the notification bell. Because what's coming next will reveal how even the gods of the North could not save their daughters. For the young Viking bride, marriage was not the start of romance. It was the end of choice. Childbearing began almost immediately. Many died in childbirth. Others lived, but their bodies and minds bore the scars of adulthood forced too soon. But perhaps the cruelest part wasn't physical. It was the silence. Their stories were not recorded, their voices lost in the shadow of their husbands' names. And yet, archaeology is beginning to whisper their truth. Recent studies of Viking burial sites show skeletal remains of women who died between ages 15 and 18, some buried with jewelry signifying marriage or motherhood. Their bodies tell stories the sagas refused to write: broken hips, malnourishment, signs of repeated childbirth. They were wives before they were women, and yet they carried the future of a civilization. The Viking Age, fierce and expansive, was built on their endurance, and that may be its greatest tragedy. When Christianity arrived in Scandinavia, it brought not just new gods, but new morals. The church began to define marriage by consent and condemned unions made with children. Gradually, the old customs shifted, but change came slowly. Even as the cross replaced the hammer, the echoes of those early marriages lingered. And by the time the sagas were written, the world that once traded children for alliances was fading, but never fully gone. Today, historians debate how widespread child marriage truly was among Vikings. Some claim it was rare. Others argue it was simply normalized by a world that measured time differently. What's certain is this: the line between child and adult was drawn not by years, but by utility. To be useful was to be grown, and to be grown was to serve the clan. But even in this brutal world, there were moments of mercy, tenderness, and rebellion. Moments we'll explore in our next story. History often remembers the Vikings for their swords, but sometimes their greatest weapons were their silences. The story of Viking child marriage is not just about cruelty. It's about how power defines love, how fear shapes culture, and how humanity, across all ages, has struggled to protect its children from its own ambition. They lived, married, and died in the cold light of necessity. But their echoes remain, in the sagas, in the graves, and in the quiet warning they whisper to us still: every empire built on blood begins in the cradle. If this story moved you, if it made you question what history hides behind its heroes, then like this video Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Because next, we're venturing into a tale even darker, a saga of betrayal, revenge, and the Viking bride who refused her fate. Click the next video on your screen and step back into the fire.